Hey there, it's Joey. Welcome back to the EDH Rec channel. On a recent episode of the EDH Rec podcast, I mentioned a commander that I simply haven't been able to get out of my head. That commander is Minthara, Merciless Soul, an uncommon Orzhov legend who gets you experience counters on your turn if you found a way to make something leave your battlefield that turn, and with that experience, she progressively protects herself and pumps up your entire board. Minthara is from the Baldur's Gate set, which I have drafted a lot. I think I've played it 7 or 8 times now, and she's always been the most fun to me. Even more fun than the time I pick one to Mirim Sentinel Worm and built a truly atrocious and unstoppable Temur Dragons deck. That one was just unreasonable, but even as great as that was, truly the most fun that I've had playing in that set has been with Minthara, who I've drafted as my commander 3 times while playing that set, and who I have smashed face with every single time. I like the hoop she asks you to jump through, the slow build into a much more powerful pump than opponents realize is going on. It's effective, but gradual in a way that lets the game simmer until your opponents don't realize that the pot has truly risen to a boil. The question was, how do I brew her in a way that doesn't just mimic my other tokens or my other aristocrat stacks, or that doesn't just devolve into good stuff? Well, the answer, of course, came to me in the form of a pun. You've already seen the title, you know what's coming, let's hop to it. Minthara has been rechristened to Minth-HARE-a, the queen of bunnies, surrounded by hare apparents everywhere. The hares are commons from magic foundations that, like Shadowbone Apostles and rat colonies before them, allow you to play any number in your deck and who create progressively more and more and more tokens as more and more of them enter play. And this works out perfect for Minth-HARE-a, who loves a bunch of tokens, turning even a few silly 1/1s into potentially 4/1s or 5/1s or 6/1s. And to go a step further, to super make sure this deck wasn't like any other I'd built, I decided to finally try out brewing a Pauper EDH deck too, where your commander is any uncommon creature, but all the cards in the deck are commons, or have at least one printing at the common rarity. So meet Minth-HARE-a, my new Pauper EDH deck. Naturally, a ton of the card slots are spoken for by all those bunnies, and honestly, right up front, there was actually kind of a comical accident of building this deck this way. One of the amazing perks of building a Pauper deck is that it can be so much cheaper to build than a regular EDH deck. While some EDH decks can rise up to the hundreds of dollars, tons of awesome and hyper-competent Pauper decks can be put together for like 10 cents per card. Super duper cheap. Suffice it to say, my brew here is doing a pretty bad job of showing off the budget friendliness of the Pauper EDH format, because hare apparents are currently like $4 or $5 a pop. If I took out the hare apparents from this list, the deck would be only like $17. So my apologies to all the Pauper EDH players out there, because I know that most Pauper decks are far cheaper to assemble than this. And for full transparency, I'm currently going to be proxying some of these buns because I have not collected them in paper yet, while I'm still getting this deck on its feet. Getting that many copies of the same high demand card is, kind of a task. But hey, at least that gives me a year-long collecting project for 2025. But regardless of all of that, can I just say, this was such a rewarding brewing experience. I read an article that came out in March of last year by Alejandro Fuentes on the website Commander's Herald, which was a great intro to Pauper EDH, and he covered some amazing details, like how at the time of his writing, the card pool for all magic cards in the whole game was 27,000, but in Pauper, you take all of that down to a pool of just 9,500-ish cards. That's a significant restriction, and depending on your color combination, your pool is even smaller than that. And as we know, restrictions breed creativity. So even with that huge limitation, it honestly still took me ages to whittle this list down to the final 99 because I was having so much fun finding cool options for it. There's a link to Alejandro's article in the description box below, of course, and I highly recommend it. He also assembled a great list of resources for Pauper EDH players if you're interested, so that is a great place to get started. And if you're taking a look at that while you're down there, if you want to give us a like and a follow, hey, we appreciate you for that too. But even if you're not interested in playing Pauper, I hope this deck is entertaining for you and that you can learn from the lessons I went through while I was putting it together, because those lessons don't just apply to Pauper, but to all EDH. What made me happiest in building this deck is how easily the commander helped guide my card choices. The main driver of this deck are, of course, the hares, progressively making 1, then 2, then 3, then a metric ton of extra rabbit tokens, and even if Minthara's ability is kind of gradual, by the time that she's giving everything like +3/+0, those tiny tokens represent a really scary amount of damage on other players. But enabling Minthara's trigger is the main hurdle, especially on the first turn she hits play, which requires us to cater our other staple categories very carefully. For instance, the removal of the deck. Playing only commons means we don't have access to the classic swords, plowshares, and Path to Exile and all of those. But by having those off the table, that just gave me more liberty to play more removal that directly helps get more experience counters, like Executioner's Capsule and Seal of Doom, or spells that force me to sacrifice a creature. Sacrificing my own creature for a removal spell isn't usually ideal, but picking off one of my own extra rabbit tokens to get rid of something really dangerous and also make all of my other future tokens even bigger for the rest of the game is well worth it. Classic commons that force everyone to sack a creature like Fleshbag and Accursed Marauder are really great here too. And as it turns out, removing non-creature cards comes very easy too. Seals of Cleansing and Westfold Riders and Cathar Commandos, y'all are super clutch. Pick off some pesky artifice or enchantment and gain extra experience, boom, we're set. I was also astonished that Soltari Visionary is a common, and while this doesn't enable Minthara's experience ability, it does benefit greatly from her pump effect because of that obnoxiously evasive shadow ability. Removing enchantments while also dealing 5, 6, 7 damage at a time for almost free is pretty fun. Oh, and the top end of the removal package is interesting too. Settle Beyond Reality is 5 mana, sure, that's not great, but when we have such limited options for removal, and when this card nukes the most important creature while also blinking a Heir Apparent to get even more tokens from it, and enabling Minthara's experience, I do think that's worth 5 mana for sure. Not having access to the staple cards kind of ends up being a blessing here because it put me in touch with these cards that I normally wouldn't have room to play, but which end up bringing a really big smile to my face because of the way that they uniquely synergize with this commander. Notably, there aren't exactly a ton of board wipes available at the common rarity, but I do like Crypt Rats, which can help deal a lot of damage when we need, if we need, in a pinch, to help us paw back into the game in case we fell behind. Now, non-creature tokens are particularly clutch for Minthara. Making treasures like Deadly Dispute does can help set her up on a future turn, because that little artifact token will be leaving our battlefield. Gilded Pinions may not look all that interesting at first blush, but playing it on turn 2 to then cast Minthara on turn 3 and to get an experience counter right away is magical Christmas land. You really want to get her trigger on the turn that she hits the field if you can. And on that note, it's really cool to see a ton of other spells, especially draw spells, that are also so terrific at helping her to accumulate experience by making those other types of non-creature tokens. Pointed Discussion draws cards and makes a blood token, for instance, which is a great thing to sacrifice. Or Fanatical Offering can sack a token, helping Minthara get an experience counter on our turn, and then make a map token, which will guarantee she's got something else that will leave the battlefield on our next turn too. Speaking of which, I think it's really important for us to visit the mana base. For one thing, because of how many of these lands help to enable Minthara. Crack an Evolving Wilds or play a bounce land, and Minthara doesn't need you to lose anything else that turn, she's going to be a happy camper right there. Those effects come in really clutch, especially the ones that we can bank and choose to sacrifice on a later turn to find extra lands or draw an extra card here and there. But no, what I really mean about the mana base is how small it is. Keen viewers probably noticed how drastically low the land count is here, only 30 lands. And listen, I'm just as surprised as you. This is not a land count I usually dip down to. But in my initial drafts of this deck, as I was playtesting here on Architect more and more, I realized I was just continuing to flood out, because wouldn't you know it, when your deck consists of a boatload of 2 mana bunnies, well, your mana curve ends up being really small. The average mana value of cards in this deck is 2.1, and I have 40 cards in this deck that cost 2 mana, and only a total of 4 cards that cost 4 mana or more. Only 4 of those. And as a point of comparison, my Thalisse deck, a regular EDH deck who also happens to be black-white tokens based, has an average mana value of 3.4 and has 24 cards that cost 4 mana or more to play. That commander definitely requires a bigger mana base and some actual proper mana boosties, but this Minthara-Hare's deck doesn't need tons of fuel to work with because so much of it costs so little to cast. That's actually why I'm playing so few ramp effects in this deck too, and frankly the ones that I kept in this list are here to help enable a Minthara trigger in case I need it because they can sacrifice. However, the most important parts of this deck, and frankly any deck, is its endgame planning. Not everything will go according to plan, and while I can't play my classic mass reanimation spells, since those are often rares and uncommon cards, I can play some cheap cards that help get multiple bunnies back from the yard super easy to make sure our army has that staying power we need. But in addition to all of that sustain, we also gotta have that late game oomph. Minthara can become a huge anthem, and it was important to me to pack a couple other interesting enablers to make sure that her pumps really do get huge by our final turns, and that my attack steps are properly scary. Some sacrifice outlets guarantee us triggers when we have a bunch of rabbits to spare. Viscera Seer and Fanatical Devotion are particular favorites of mine, and blink spells like Ephemerate are great to both give us experience and to get more rabbits from a Hera parent for a super small mana investment. And of course, I have a little touch of extra proliferate in here too. You can see that I favored instant speed proliferate effects in case I'm able to use them as a mid-combat trick and snipe some extra final points of damage that I may need when people are not expecting it. But the real trick is getting the damage through, because other people will definitely have blockers. Sometimes I just really want to guarantee that my stuff won't be blocked well so I can clock someone for true, proper lethal. Now, at common, mass evasion is hard to find, but it's not impossible. A couple Intimidate, Fear, and Flying spells are exactly what the doctor ordered. These are, functionally, my Pauper version of an overwhelming stampede effect, which is hilarious. My commander does the pumping part, but these cards guarantee that the damage carries over properly to our opponent. The Gust Rider is my personal favorite piece of tech here. If I get 4 experience counters, then sacrificing this creature means suddenly all of my bunnies will fly. Bet a whole lot of opponents will not see that coming. But I also have to shout out a protection effect here too. Spare from Evil, granting my board protection from non-humans, which means they can't block me, only humans can block me, is frankly upsettingly good. Humans are a common enough creature type to see, but if I need to get through a small wall of like Mir or elves or something, this is a perfect card for the job to make sure that they will miss me completely. Like, I'm wondering whether I need to put this card into other decks too, as another unexpected source of you can't block me this turn. This is really, really cool. This is actually why I like Cartel Aristocrat in this deck so much too. It enables Minthara when we need it to, but it could also just possibly get big enough to clock someone for lethal damage, and by sacrificing 1 or 2 creatures, we might be able to give it enough protection to make it unblockable against the right person. And actually, speaking of sacrifice outlets again, listen, I can't change who I am as a person. There are also a few bonus Aristocrats effects in here too to help make use of all those tokens in case they die, which might just help clean up the final few life points enemies have after they've been attacked by so many huge bunnies. I think the effects of these cards will indeed be quite bunishing. Okay, I apologize for that. It's not all bunnies in this deck after all. I did give myself permission to play one other fluffy token maker here too, and that's Nested Shambler. A 1-drop that can be sacrificed to convert into a ton of X1 squirrels. It's just too good for this commander to pass up. It is indeed nuts. And also I think the rabbits are happy to have some other little critters here for more company. Man, the one problem I have with this deck is that whenever I play it, I always seem to have a bad hair day. Sorry, I couldn't help it. The temptation was simply irresistible. I mentioned this already, but I think it bears repeating. This really was a fascinating experiment, particularly because of how familiar it was. So many steps of the deck building process felt exactly the same as they would in regular EDH brewing. Finding staple categories, finding color fixing, finding late game power moves, all just with a new cast of cards that is still really dang good once all is said and done. Like seriously, my first pile of cards for this Pauper deck was like 160 cards or something like that. Being restricted only to commons did not make me feel like I was thin on options for awesome cards to run. What's more, any main deviations I had from the typical deck building traditions, such as with this deck's low mana base count, were also very familiar to me too. They had precedent and touchstones in regular EDH brewing. It reminded me a lot of building like an elf deck or a Lurrus deck. Having the normal number of lands and ramp in decks like those means that you're probably going to flood out and flood out hard. And that happened to also be true here of a deck that has a 2.1 mana curve. Figuring out your deck's relationship to mana flood is a really important lesson, whether you're playing Pauper or otherwise. What I especially love though was how having such strong railings hyper encouraged the deck not to ever deviate into good stuff territory. When all those classic powerhouses are off the table, you know, all those uncommons and rares that are just good in every deck regardless of their synergy, I mean, without those, I really got to focus properly on what makes this particular commander tick, which suddenly turned every card that I draw into something really, really exciting. And that's a principle that I think we can all take to heart. So I hope you enjoyed this hair-raising deck. And I'd really love to hear from other folks out there who play or are interested in Pauper EDH. What tips and tricks do you recommend for people who want to give it a try? Remember also to give Alejandro's article a look down in the description below if you're interested too. And of course to do the YouTube things while you're there. But with that, I will bid you a fond and fluffy farewell. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.